the breakthrough that he makes. After having done this, he says the following. He says, so one cannot know by how much it diverges from ultimate precision, since it is not reachable with a usual number. And therefore this error can also not be removed, since it is only comprehensible through a higher insight and by no means through a visible attempt. From that alone, you can now know that only in the domain inaccessible to our knowledge will a more precise value be reached. I have not found that this realization has been passed along until now. Right? This is the place where he actually identifies that his discovery is something which he recognizes not to have been passed along or until now. And the key to this is the section which is entitled On the Search for Proportionals. And there he makes a distinction which was not made by the Greek mathematicians and geometers. The Greeks, including Archimedes, knew that there were rational numbers and then there were incommensurables, which they would call irrational, in the sense of not rational numbers. And such an irrational or incommensurable relationship would be, for instance, if you took a square and you have a diagonal. Now that diagonal is not commensurable with the side of the square. It's an irrational relationship. But that diagonal is not ontologically superior to that side, or vice versa. What Nicolas of Cusa has done is to distinguish between two types of incommensurables, or two types of incommensurables. The diagonal and the side is one type of proportional, which you can call an algebraic incommensurable or a irrational. And I'll read to you. It says, but in order to investigate the proportionals, one must pay attention to the following. Among the non-proportional lengths, some are like the side and diagonal in the square, and a proportion so precise can never be found that the divergence is not larger than a rational fraction. Okay? Then he says, another non-proportionality is that of the incidental and the rectilinear angle. Because a length that corresponds to the incidental angle is non-proportional to a length that corresponds to a rectilinear angle. So forth. Okay? So the point is that what Nicolas of Cusa has done is to show that the non-proportional, which is the relationship between the incidental angle and the rectilinear angle, that is between a polygon and a circle, is of a different order than this incommensurate relationship. And in doing that, he actually was the first one. In other words, others said, okay, you can't measure a circle line by a straight line. Others had said that. This guy Campanus in the 13th century had pointed to this paradox. But the breakthrough that Cusa makes is to say that the circle has a greater power than the polygons. And the incommensurable relationship between the circle and the polygons is therefore of a transcendental nature. It transcends in power the polygons. Right? You can have, for instance, if you have, I mean, look at this. If you have what if we put a circle around the square? We have two levels of incommensurables here. We've inscribed a square within a circle. The diagonal of that square, which we can draw, the diameter, is incommensurate with the side, but is not ontologically superior to the side. Whereas the circle is ontologically superior to the polygon within it, and including the diagonal and the side. It is prior in the same sense that the oneness is prior to multiplicity. Now, furthermore, and going back to this idea that various Aristotelians denied that this was an angle, and argued that on the basis that since that's a straight line and small, there's no angle there at all at the point of contact of the tangent in the circle. So they would argue that this angle is equal to 0. It's null. What Cusa argues is that it's not null. It is virtually dimensionless space. That if you go from the, or to go back to this idea of the diameter as you rotate it, right? You rotate it there, you rotate it here, then you can rotate it here, and then when you rotate it out to the tangent, right? That it goes, the diameter goes from a rectilinear angle, which is less than the angle of the semicircle, to a tangent and a cornicular angle, which is greater. Or actually, it goes to a right angle, which is greater than the angle of the semicircle, right? Without ever being equal. That's a discontinuity. That discontinuity exists. In fact, see, this is the whole point in terms of modern science, which is that the empiricists argue that only that which is a hard ball, right, a finite straight line is real. But what Nicolas of Cusa has just established here is that there's a higher ontological reality than these discrete, so-called material atoms of Epicurus or this linearity of Euclid, right? And in fact, you cannot define, you cannot even attain to the circle from that standpoint, from down, down under. And that there are all sorts of implications of this. This is not unrelated to the ontological proof of the existence of God. That which is, that the circle is actually, it's obviously a metaphor. It's not, God is not a circle. But the point is that the relationship is similar. That which seems to be virtually null existent, which some people therefore say doesn't exist, right? As they say God doesn't exist, is nonetheless ontologically primary and is the efficient cause of that which is generated as derived from it, i.e. the polygon. The polygon is derived. It is the equivalent of created nature in respect to the circle, which is a beginning without beginning. So the whole point that LaRouche makes in all of his writings in the recent period is that he takes example of a thought. How much weight does a thought have? How wide is a thought? All right, it's virtually dimensionless, and yet a thought, an hypothesis, can transform the world. All right, and has a valid thought of a higher power, cardinality, put into practice can change the world. Nicolas of Cusa writes in a number of his works. There's one on Barillas. He says, God creates real being and natural forms. Man, in his image, creates rational entities. That's a pretty literal translation from the Latin. It's ratio ens, E-N-S, which is the word for entities. A rational object. This is, it's virtually word for word for what LaRouche has called a thought object, or Riemann calls a Geistes, Mass, or the plural would be Massen, Geistes Massen, which is a thought object or a spiritual object, mental object, which is also Plato's concept of hypothesis. And so he says, man creates rational entities and artificial forms. All right? Again, as distinct, God creates real being and natural forms. Man creates rational entities through his mind, and then artificial forms. And what this is the beginning of a technological revolution, because he's saying we create rational objects, thoughts, which we can then put into, we can apply in the form of new technologies. There's one work called The Game of the Spheres. He says that man, he says that the soul is the power of reason. That's what the soul is, the power of reason. And that's what distinguishes man from a beast. That the human mind is capable of inventing something new, as opposed to an animal. And that, which is the same idea as create rational entities. Or another work he writes is called On Conjectures, where he says the same sort of thing, that conjecture, or a hypothesis, is a thought object. And now, but the further point is, what's implied in his discovery of transcendental as opposed to merely irrational numbers is that these ideas can become increasingly powerful. The transcendental number is of a greater power than is an irrational number. And as in the history of mathematical science, since Cusa, there has also been developed the idea of the transfinite, of Aleph. And the point here is that man is capable of developing ideas of increasing power, which allows him, through the implementation of artificial forms, technologies, both in terms of economic technologies, but also in terms of the arts. He's developed new technologies which can increase man's power over nature, which goes back to Genesis. The question of, in other words, man being created in the image of God, therefore as creative, is capable of generating new ideas which are of increasing power when implemented in the form of artificial forms, i.e. technologies. And therefore, man is capable of increasing his potential relative population density, his power over nature, for the good. That good measured in terms of both increased human life, but also in terms of increased human creativity. That is, more people who are increasingly in the image of God by becoming more creative, by being geniuses. So, what you have with Cusa's development of this is more than a mathematical or scientific discovery. The implications of this are a reflection of the fact that man is created in the image of God and therefore is creative. His discovery of a concept of a higher power, of a higher order of species, is living proof of all of our capacity to develop further such ideas which increase the human species' power over nature, and thus allow us to more powerfully act out of love for our neighbor, out of love for God, by being in the image of God, which is the best way to express one's love of God, is to be in his image, and not to be less than that. So this is, so going back to what I said in the beginning, I know this has been long, but the point is, it's by replicating in one's own mind these kinds of crucial discoveries. All right? Having the self-confidence to realize that what Cusa is saying here is true, as opposed to what some of these textbook footnotes say. In other words, the whole Aristotelian faction has since Cusa, they black out Cusa, all right, and then what they say is that one person, at least, it'd be interesting to trace down his background, but says that there's a paradox here. But then there's a major campaign, a violent campaign, to eliminate this breakthrough and say no such, no such angle exists. It's not a true angle. The circle is a straight line in the small at the point of contact with the tangent. That seems like maybe an esoteric idea, but the fact of the matter is that right there is an attempt to snuff creativity out. It's precisely because LaRouche has demonstrated capability to revive things, ideas such as this, and to go beyond them, that you would have the kind of persecution against this movement that we have had. That you would have the FBI trying to mobilize the Communist Party USA in 1973 to eliminate LaRouche. In the same way as these so-called scientists want to eliminate the virtually dimensionless space between this tangent and the angle of the semicircle. Same reason. Because if you have creativity, then in fact you have a Republican citizenry which can govern itself, can actually carry out self-government. Because it has educated itself to be able to see what is creativity as opposed to what is not. So again, I think the actual interesting thing is to say, if you follow this through, can you see that in fact Archimedes' approximation is not true equality, that these are two different species, the polygon and the circle, that yes, we can come up with an approximation, but that, through Archimedean methods, as Cusa himself does, but that there's a higher reality or a higher truth here. All right, and can you have the intellectual self-confidence to know that those people who say that this is not a true angle are in the wrong? Because if you looked at it without this knowledge, if you looked at this Euclid book and you read the footnote, you would have to conclude that that in fact that's not a true angle, and it's been decided. It's a decided issue that that's not an angle. For instance, I translated this piece from the German, and I have the footnotes to the German. And this piece was translated in German, and you have the footnotes. Now, listen, the really horrendous thing is that if you read these footnotes, this is what you'd get. Quoting Pelletier, the person who writes the footnote says that he was the first one to establish that the contingent angle, in truth, is equal to 0. And then it says, in the Middle Ages, one was, however, not of this opinion. And then later on, the person who does the footnote says, talking about the contingent angle and the rectilinear angle. He says, we know therefore that the rational approximation can indeed become more precise than any rational magnitude. That, however, the transition to the infinitesimal magnitude, whose existence we flatly deny, is inadmissible. Right. So what you have here is, even if you were to read these footnotes, the footnotes are useful because, as are the Euclid footnotes, because if you go at it from the standpoint of a detective, you can actually you can actually read what's being, you can learn from what is actually being denied in the footnotes. But you have to realize that you have an entire intellectual so-called campaign which is run in order to wipe out these advances so that people don't even know about them.
And it was
In-
cultural warfare against the
That's-
minds of our people,
Yeah.
especially children.
Children should be taught things of this sort.
Right.
This occurred in 1440,
Right.
this breakthrough.
Yeah.
550 years later, they're still denying that this was even a breakthrough.
And our survival's at stake.
Yeah. To know that there is such a higher level of mathematics has implications and can be explained to a child. This is what children should be learning in school. We shouldn't have to wait until we're, 40, 50, 60 years old in order to be exposed to this.
When we're all
More or
upset.
less.
We're upset about not having learned it.
But it really is the case.
Problem is the teachers don't understand this.
No, they don't, because they have a textbook and they're supposed to teach certain things which are useful as long as you recognize their limitations. Just as this method of approximation arrive at pi is useful as long as you realize that it's only an approximation and there's a you're already talking about different species here. So it's not to deny these things as having some use, but it is to say that those who deny a higher reality are actually decorticating a population. This really goes, just to conclude, there's a short story of Edgar Allan Poe, which I always like to cite. It's called Malanta Torta, because it goes at this whole issue. What Edgar Allan Poe says is, what he reports is that an oligarchy can control the population if it can convince the population that there are only two pathways to truth. And those two pathways were pioneered by some very prominent philosophers, according to Edgar Allan Poe. The first pathway was pioneered by a philosopher by the name of Hogg, and he developed what was called the Baconian method after Francis Bacon and after Hogg. And this is the inductive method of empiricism of Francis Bacon. That is, how does a hog know anything? It knows what's in its pen by what it snorts with its nose, and that's it. So if you can control the pen and what's in the pen, that's going to be the limit of what the hog knows. So that's one easy method of control. The second method was pioneered by a Hindu philosopher by the name of Aristotle, according to Edgar Allan Poe, and that's the deductive method, right? So, and Aristotle admits that Aristotle has 10 categories from which you make deductions. You come to conclusions based upon these fixed categories of thought. He admits in his writings, which most people don't read, and that's probably fortunate in many respects, except that if you were to read him as a detective would, he admits that all of his categories are ultimately derived from sense perception, right? So they're really the same method. You generalize from what the pig eats and smells in the pig pen, and you get these fixed categories of thought, and then you're supposed to make deductions from those fixed categories of thought back into the pig pen. So it's a circular arrangement, and it's pretty much what happens in political life. If politics is defined in terms of liberal conservative, you have if economics is defined in terms of Milton Friedman on the one hand and John Maynard Keynes on the other hand, and you leave out the American system altogether, you control people in terms of these false choices. You think that these become very militant in choosing one or the other, or you become apathetic and just don't figure none of this is worthwhile, and therefore you fall into the abyss. So Edgar Allan Poe goes on to say that he compares these two methods to creeping and crawling, just to make sure you can distinguish between the two. And then, but he says the problem here is that neither of these are the nature of man, and the nature of man, he says, is to soar, to fly, mentally to soar, and he says the method of soaring is the method of guessing, the method of hypothesis. And he actually refers to Kepler in this short story as an example of what such guessing is. Guessing not in the sense of arbitrary guessing, but scientific hypothesis, right? Coming up with the kind of idea that Nicolas of Cusa came up with here. In fact, if you read Kepler's work, his early work, Mysterium Cosmographicum, you will, in the second book of that, where he discusses where his whole breakthroughs in astronomy derive from, he refers explicitly to Nicolas of Cusa's quadrature of the circle. So from this, you get Kepler and the laws of the universe and the development of modern physics directly from this, explicitly, self-consciously. So what Poe's saying is, you know, the way you achieve political freedom is by people developing the capacity to soar through generating hypotheses, by being creative, as opposed to creeping and crawling. And as long as we creep and crawl, then we're controlled by an oligarchy. But when we act in the way which is characteristic of human beings in our nature, that is by being creative, then we're not controllable. And that's the importance of going through this kind of process, to actually rediscover that, to actually, if you have questions, try to work through the questions as to why this is the case as opposed to not being the case. And if you go through that yourself and you have the confidence of having, I've rediscovered this, not that it's a new discovery, but I've rediscovered it myself, I've replicated that, that's part of developing that habit in your own mind of being creative. You have a taste of what it means to make by replicating a great axiomatic revolutionary breakthrough in the history of humanity. And that can only strengthen you and us in terms of the kind of tasks that we have before us. So instead of, you know, when something comes up politically, creeping and crawling, we as LaRouche does, define those policies which are actually transcendental or transfinite in respect to what otherwise is a trap. So that's pretty much what I want to say. So.
What you just said, I mean, I just thought about this because it's something that we were at this rally last night where Clinton was at, and we had the pro-life people there, and I was telling one of the supporters that, and I thought about this based on what you just said, this whole argument about pro-life, pro-choice is a created argument in terms of the important issue is that you don't have to debate about something like that. That should be already, you know, in terms of higher thought, that a life is a life, and it's not necessary to argue about when I'm pro-choice and I'm pro-life. Is that kind of like what you just explained in terms of?
Well, I mean, it's like it's like at this recent Cairo conference, there were many people who, because they reduced the issue to that of abortion as a single issue, allowed themselves to be manipulated by Venetian British forces who are out to destroy the presidency. Part of it is it's a certain kind of blindness, which is this. The point is, opposition to abortion obviously is a reflection of natural law, but where if you only are opposed to abortion and you blind yourself to the fact that there's more than one way, right, to break the Ten Commandments, right? So you take something like what has happened in this country is that many people have allowed themselves to be manipulated by the British and then Bush, who they claim to be pro-life, right, into an attack upon Clinton. They become blind to what is actually the potential of what Clinton is doing. At the same time, they're blind to the fact that, I mean, yeah, fine. So if you look at the actual record, the Reagan and Bush administrations, even if they were supposedly, nominally, anti-abortion in the U.S., were carrying out NSSM 200, sterilizing women in the third world. Right? They never stopped that. That was actually going on at an accelerated rate. Furthermore, they were engaged in an unjust war under Bush in Iraq, in Panama, so they're committing genocide. So you're going to support somebody because he's nominally anti-abortion when he's carrying out a foreign policy which is sterilizing women, is carrying out a foreign policy of unjust wars, committing genocide in the Middle East and in Latin America, and at the same time is backing a policy of usury, which also violates the Ten Commandments,
Right.
by backing the IMF, which is not only stealing in the form of usury, but when usury goes to the point where it results in hunger and death, it's murder. So the point is, this is the case of creeping and crawling when you reduce the world to a single issue and say, I'm going to measure everything by this, when in fact people are being killed by other means at the same time, and you end up backing a Bush and his crew, backed by Margaret Thatcher and the British, whose policies will destroy the world, and opposing Clinton because you've measured everything in terms of this issue, which doesn't mean that you should embrace abortion, but it's that you have to think through the issues on this higher level, so that you see what the actual potential is in Clinton, since he is the president. Bush set up the former Yugoslavia for the genocide there. Right? I mean, Bush set up what would have otherwise been a trap that Clinton would have moved into in terms of invading Haiti. He set that up. All of this was set up by Bush. And what people, because they reduce it to a single issue, they end up actually being immoral in practice through sins of omission and also sins of commission in respect to the rest of the Decalogue. And, one of the best things to read is the Appendix B to the Truth About Temporal Eternity in Fidelio, in which LaRouche points out that Adam Smith and his economics violates, the entire Ten Commandments. It basically breaks all 10 commandments in pieces and then spits in the face of God. And you have these so-called conservatives who are nominally anti-abortion, but then embrace that which violates the 10 Commandments altogether and spits in the face of God and say that they're Christians. So the point is to get people to rise above that kind of mentality and think in terms which allow us to essentially get out of hell and into purgatory on the road to paradise for humanity as a whole. And it's that blindness which is
they wanted
deadly.
to really fight abortion. There's other ways to do it instead of just like being single-minded. I'm against it, and in actuality, they help facilitate abortions by arguing with these people that are supposedly for a choice. The whole it's a big vicious.
Yeah, the only solution is really, which they ignore, because even from the standpoint of the Catholic Church, it's all of the social encyclicals which call for development being the new name of peace, and that's ignored.
Yeah.
The real issue is, can we economically develop the world so that we have an economy which places proper value on all human beings and requires more human beings who are, the society is committed to and does educate.
There won't even be a thought in terms of arguing about it.
If we had an economy moving ahead, we would need 25 billion people just to work in that economy.
You have to have the means to survive, support these people in a growing economy with growing population.
Well, if we develop the economy, then we undercut the climate in which of pessimism and of death in which the pro-abortion position flourishes.
Mr. Wertz,
Can we put it in a larger context, what you really talk about, and put it historically and internationally? If we look at the map behind you, we see that this is the world. This is the international, let's say, map, or this is the world. And here it is, this movement. We consider it has a great task and challenge, which is the golden renaissance at the present time. You talk about the 15th century and the 16th century of Mr. Nicolas of Cusa and what he has done to generate this dialogue. If we look at that particular time, which your lecture comes under the title A Strategy for Victory over the New Dark Ages. At that time, when Europe was living in dark ages, if you look at the other part of the world, it was not really dark ages. You take China, you take India, you take the Middle East, Africa, you will notice that there was a great civilization which emphasized also in mathematics, algebraic science, and calculus. And that's why they were able, for example, to build the pyramids, or to build Spain, to build these great universities also even in Spain, the Moorish, which is the Arab, let's say, culture in the, between 600 and 1200. So the Dark Ages wasn't really all over the world, but it's nice that people in Europe recognize that they are really living at that time in a Dark Ages. We, at the present time, and the movement right now, understand that politically and from the point of view of the oligarchy who are controlling the world, let the whole world live under what we call it the New Dark Ages. Can we really reach that conclusion that we do feel that the world now is living under a new dark ages, and it is the challenge of this movement, the way it was in the 15th century and 14th century, the challenge of that movement of Nicolas of Cusa. Is that what you try to, transfer to us at this point?
Yeah, LaRouche develops this more thoroughly in this paper on Bertrand Russell, and it's also, there's a book called The New Dark Ages Conspiracy, which we published back in the 80s, and also I'd recommend reading the pamphlet which LaRouche wrote on the coming financial disintegration. Let me just it is definitely the case that there have been a number of renaissances in human history. There's obviously the Greek classical Renaissance in Ionia, and then centered primarily in Athens, particularly around Plato. The Arab Renaissance itself was a reflection of the influence of the Greek classics, and that's what it means. It's a renaissance of that teaching, particularly of the works of Plato. And of course, Chinese civilization and earlier Indian civilization, among others, have experienced certain types of renaissances. That's a reflection of the fact that all men and women are created in the image of God, and therefore, on the basis of creative reason, are certainly capable of making scientific discoveries and artistic discoveries which can actually fuel an improvement of human life. What is unique about the European Renaissance is that, for instance, even though there was an earlier Arab Renaissance, that had pretty much attenuated by that time. There were certain things that were still being passed on, including into Europe, but it had already attenuated, primarily because of the influence of Aristotle on such thinkers as Al-Ghazali and Averroes and so forth. Now, as opposed to a Platonic influence, as reflected in Ibn Sina and others. The uniqueness of the European Renaissance is measured in what has occurred over the last 550 to 600 years. That is, if you look at population growth and potential population density on the face of the earth, not just in Europe, but globally, because it actually had a global impact. That Renaissance had a radiating effect on the globe, which was actually greater than any previous Renaissance. And it's this kind of discovery which LaRouche argues, and I would also support, was unique and brought about a revolution in a way which had not occurred in any previous Renaissance. Now, what he develops in this paper is very interesting, because he points out that, okay, it's not that this became the dominant and victorious factor in all of either European culture or world culture. That there continued to be a fight between the forces of the Renaissance, as expressed by Cusa, and Venice, and the Venetians who were Aristotelian. And that this fight has continued. What I discussed here was an expression of that in the field of science and mathematics by all of these figures who were denying that the circle was a different species than a polygon, and then, saying that this angle doesn't exist. These were of the Venetian party. So increasingly, what has happened is that all progress that has been achieved as a result of this Renaissance perspective. But that has become attenuated to the point where, particularly in the last 30 years, the common culture has become increasingly Venetian dominated in the sense of empiricism, people being ruled not by their creativity, but by allowing themselves to become banal, to be driven by their sensual passions and so forth.
Emotions.
Yeah. So, and the further point is that although that the Renaissance faction made possible technological progress, scientific progress, the fact of the matter is that in the last 30 years especially, that commitment to technological progress in science has been in large part wiped out by the emphasis upon a post-industrial society and the diminishment of any commitment to real economic development for people, and instead the emphasis upon speculative investment, usury. The point that LaRouche makes is that we're at the end of a 550 to 600 year cycle, and that the fact that the Venetian philosophy, it's not a question of particular people even per se, but the Venetian philosophy has taken hold, and the Renaissance forces which are responsible for all progress that has occurred are in a reduced situation, has created a situation in terms of the financial system in the world where we're on the verge of a financial disintegration, which would be on a scale greater than what occurred in the 13th and 14th century. So the point here is not that a dark age is inevitable. There are aspects of a dark age currently, just by the circumstances I've described. But the question is, do we have to go through massive depopulation? Do we have to go through immiseration of the world's population? There are people who advocate reducing the world's population to 2 billion, to 300 million, and so forth. So, anti-human, are they? So filled with most likely self-hatred. But the point is, if that collapse comes, we don't believe that it's absolutely necessary to go through such a dark age. The point is, how do you create a circumstance in which you can avoid the dark age, that real decline into the abyss, and use the collapse of bankrupt financial institutions and the shock of that to get people to move forward with a program of development and reorganize those financial institutions so that we can move forward with development. How do you affect that change immediately? And that's what we're trying to do. In other words, what you've got to do is you've got to create a climate in the world in which, as the collapse occurs, there are sufficient individuals and institutions which know of an alternative that would take the world into an entirely different geometry. And what LaRouche has developed in particular is this, I guess there are maps on the board back there, but what he is focused on is that, you know, what is the area in the world with the greatest population density, and therefore the greatest capacity for being developed productively in the most rapid time, and what is the program which would also represent the most decisive break from British geopolitics, which has brought the world into this in this direction, and that is this whole idea of Eurasian development focused on transportation infrastructure development, water development, energy development, but primarily transportation development. The point is, if you look at the history of the United States became a nation, you know, it spanned the continent through railroad development during the 1800s. And there were plans in the late 1800s and into the beginning of this century to develop major rail all the way across Russia from Europe. And into Asia, and also down into the Middle East. There was the railroad to Baghdad, which was proposed. The British saw this as a threat. The idea of developing industrially this entire landmass, which, as you can see from this map, is the biggest concentrated landmass in the entire world. There are no railroads which connect all of this.
There's a Trans-Siberian Railroad.
Well, yeah, but I mean in terms of a network of railroads. I mean, some have been developed, but not in a real sense, and also not high technology railroads.
Right.
The point is, if you develop a productive triangle of railroads in this area, from France, Paris, to Berlin, to Warsaw, and also to Vienna, Wien, and as a triangle, and then has spiral arms that shoot off, not only you can have those shooting down into former Yugoslavia and then into Russia. At the same time, the Chinese are talking about developing railroads where the Silk routes used to be, and connecting those up with those railroads that are going across Russia. Then that becomes the medium for a major development of the economy of the world, which gives us the potential in terms of productive output then to develop, particularly the third world, Africa, Ibero-America, the rest of Asia. And the U.S. playing a role in fostering that would be crucial to breaking through the Malthusian culture which exists. It would be the direct opposite of British geopolitics. It would be the direct opposite of monetarism in terms of economic policy, because it would be oriented towards real physical product.
And the British couldn't dominate the development plan like that.
Britain would be, you know, they'd be begging to get, you know, a piece of the action. But it's only through that that would represent a higher order concept in this period, which would lay the basis for finally defeating what was impeded at the Cairo conference by developing the world economy. Yes?
Does LaRouche need exoneration to apply for the presidential candidate? I presume that's the reason he needs exoneration.
No, he needs exoneration because the United States and the world need his exoneration. No, he doesn't need to.
To run for presidency, you don't need exoneration?
No, you can run. He ran for president in 1992 from jail.
Well, maybe he had any trouble. Could he put a sub to his in, but the name with less fire in it like the rest of the guys?
No, the point is that what you have to realize is that the mentality that it is uniquely only if the institutions of this country and the population of this country work with us and of the world work with us to achieve LaRouche's exoneration, would you actually defeat the forces which put him in jail, which are the same forces which are trying to destroy this country the presidency, and which are preventing, the development programs which could actually turn the world around. In other words, exoneration is like the key discontinuity, which it's the key discontinuity which will allow you to proceed into a higher geometry. That's the only way you can actually explain the thing. In other words, if the U.S. population and the institutions of this country do not bring about justice in the case of LaRouche, then that's because they're afraid of the very forces which not only put LaRouche in jail, right, but oppose the policies for which he stands. There's no shortcut to that. In other words, it's,
you don't want to be dead if you don't get exonerated. You don't want to be dead.
the point is we will be dead unless we reverse this. We will be dead unless we reverse this injustice. Yes. That's why people like. That's why people. No, hold it. No, because actually, I think this is an important point to go over. See, what you have to realize is this. LaRouche, it's not just a question of some individual, some injustice. You have to look at the policies he represents, the people who put him in jail. You will not change this country for the better unless you defeat Henry Kissinger and those who stand behind him who put LaRouche in jail. The only way you will defeat Henry Kissinger is by exonerating LaRouche.
So he needs President Clinton and his stooge Attorney General to be exonerated.
No, he needs the American population to demand that whatever avenue.
Most of the population don't know about the LaRouche. Only got bad taste in their mouth. They're ignorant.
Well, that's why we've gotten out. Well, by November 8th, we'll have 5 million pamphlets distributed around the country, and if we need to get out 200 million, we'll do that.
Which pamphlet? About his being in jail? You talking about?
The evidence of his
Most people
innocence.
don't read. They're lucky to read that page. When you got 4 pages, they ain't gonna read it.
Well, we're not. That is why we're in the mess we are, because they refuse to use their brains. There's no shortcut. There is no shortcut. That's the whole point of what we're talking about.
Most people say I can't do nothing. That's all I hear. I can't do nothing.
Yeah.
Baloney.
We don't
They're
we don't
creating-
exonerate LaRouche, then we're held hostage.
There will be no.
We're held hostage by the geometry
You people are
of a new dark age.
because you're with God. You're gonna make it.
Well, my Christian friends say,
Well, that's true. That. Yeah. Well, let me try.
Keep it in mind.
Done is to distinguish between two types of incommensurables, or two types of incommensurables. The diagonal and the side is one type of proportional, which you can call an algebraic incommensurable or a irrational. And I'll read to you. It says, but in order to investigate the proportionals, one must pay attention to the following. Among the non-proportional lengths, some are like the side and diagonal in the square, and a proportion so precise can never be found that the divergence is not larger than a rational fraction. Okay? Then he says, another non-proportionality is that of the incidental and the rectilinear angle. Because a length that corresponds to the incidental angle is non-proportional to a length that corresponds to a rectilinear angle. So forth. Okay? So the point is that what Nicolas of Cusa has done is to show that the non-proportional, which is the relationship between the incidental angle and the rectilinear angle, that is between a polygon and a circle, is of a different order than this incommensurate relationship. And in doing that, he actually was the first one. In other words, others said, okay, you can't measure a circle line by a straight line. Others had said that. This guy Campanus in the 13th century had pointed to this paradox. But the breakthrough that Cusa made, really the breakthrough that he makes. After having done this, he says the following. He says, so one cannot know by how much it diverges from ultimate precision, since it is not reachable with a usual number. And therefore this error can also not be removed since it is only comprehensible through a higher insight and by no means through a visible attempt. From that alone, you can now know that only in the domain inaccessible to our knowledge will a more precise value be reached. I have not found that this realization has been passed along until now. Right? This is the place where he actually identifies that his discovery is something which he recognizes not to have been passed along or until now. And the key to this is the section which is entitled On the Search for Proportionals. And there he makes a distinction which was not made by the Greek mathematicians and geometers. The Greeks, including Archimedes, knew that there were rational numbers and then there were incommensurables, which they would call irrational, in the sense of not rational numbers. And such an irrational or incommensurable relationship would be, for instance, if you took a square and you have a diagonal. Now that diagonal is not commensurable with the side of the square. It's an irrational relationship. But that diagonal is not ontologically superior to that side, or vice versa. What Nicolas of Cusa has, there are all sorts of implications of this. This is not unrelated to the ontological proof of the existence of God. That which is, that the circle is actually, it's obviously a metaphor. It's not, God is not a circle. But the point is that the relationship is similar. That which seems to be virtually null existent, which some people therefore say doesn't exist, right? As they say God doesn't exist, is nonetheless ontologically primary and is the efficient cause of that which is generated as derived from it, i.e. the polygon. The polygon is derived. It is the equivalent of created nature in respect to the circle, which is a beginning without beginning. So the whole point that LaRouche makes in all of his writings in the recent period is that he takes example of a thought. How much weight does a thought have? How wide is a thought? All right, it's virtually dimensionless. And yet a thought, an hypothesis, can transform the world. All right, and has. A valid thought of a higher power, cardinality, put into practice can change the world. Nicolas of Cusa writes in a number of his works, one is to say that the circle has a greater power than the polygons. And the incommensurable relationship between the circle and the polygons is therefore of a transcendental nature. It transcends in power the polygons. Right? You can have, for instance, if you have, look at this. If you have what if we put a circle around the square? We have two levels of incommensurables here. We've inscribed a square within a circle. The diagonal of that square, which we can draw, the diameter, is incommensurate with the side, but is not ontologically superior to the side. Whereas the circle is ontologically superior to the polygon within it, and including the diagonal and the side. It is prior in the same sense that the oneness is prior to multiplicity. Now, furthermore, and going back to this idea that various Aristotelians denied that this was an angle, and argued that on the basis that since that's a straight line and small, there's no angle there at all at the point of contact of the tangent in the circle. So they would argue that this angle is equal to zero. It's null. what Cusa argues is that it's not null. It is virtually dimensionless space. That if you go from the, or to go back to this idea of the diameter as you rotate it, right? You rotate it there, you rotate it here, then you can rotate it here, and then when you rotate it out to the tangent, right? That it goes, the diameter goes from a rectilinear angle, which is less than the angle of the semicircle, to a tangent and a cornicular angle, which is greater. Or actually, it goes to a right angle, which is greater than the angle of the semicircle, right? Without ever being equal. That's a discontinuity. That discontinuity exists. In fact, see, this is the whole point in terms of modern science, which is that the empiricists argue that only that which is a hard ball, right, a finite straight line is real. But what Nicolas of Cusa has just established here is that there's a higher ontological reality than these discrete, so-called material atoms of Epicurus or this linearity of Euclid, right? And in fact, you cannot even attain to the circle from that standpoint, from down, down under. And that